Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting through the theories that have shaped Five Nights at Freddy's understanding. The connections hidden in plain sight, the identities obscured by time and tragedy, the questions that whisper through every game, every minigame, every carefully placed detail that Scott Cawthon wove into this tapestry of mystery. These are not random observations, but threads that, when pulled gently, reveal patterns beneath the chaos. From the guard who wore a name too familiar to be coincidence, to the nightmares that belonged to someone living when logic said they should have belonged to the dead, to the nature of punishment and whether it arrives through dreams or something darker still. We'll trace each theory through evidence left in survival logbooks and hidden phone calls, through character behaviors and timeline impossibilities, through the spaces where Scott told us to look closer, because nothing, absolutely nothing, was placed without purpose. Some of these theories have become pillars that hold the community's understanding steady. Others spark debates that burn through forums and comment sections, dividing those who see one truth from those who see another. But each offers a lens through which the story shifts, revealing new dimensions of a narrative told across dimensions, across lives, across the thin membrane between guilt and redemption. Whether you're encountering these arguments for the first time, revisiting them with evidence you've gathered since, or simply allowing the rhythm of analysis to carry you towards sleep like a lullaby made of mysteries, this journey will guide you through. Every theory examined with the patience it deserves, every piece of evidence given its weight, until you can see the shape of truths that hide in shadows. Before we begin our descent into these fascinating depths, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and which FNAF theory has kept you awake, wondering, searching for one more piece of proof. And if you enjoy this kind of slow, thorough exploration that values understanding over speed, please consider subscribing. It truly helps this channel grow. Let's begin. In the quiet hours of 1993, a security guard named Mike Schmidt accepted employment at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The name appeared on a paycheck after 5 nights of survival, a simple signature on a document that should have meant nothing beyond payment for services rendered. Just another name in a long line of guards who took the night shift, endured the mechanical wanderings, and left with more questions than answers. But in a franchise where names echo with intention, where every Jeremy and Fritz carries double meaning, where even the smallest detail roots itself in story, could this name truly be meaningless? Years passed in our world. More games released. The story expanded beyond that first pizzeria, into sister locations and underground facilities, into minigames that peeled back decades of history. And in 2016, when Sister Location opened its doors to players, we met someone new, Michael Afton, speaking in tones that carried exhaustion and determination in equal measure, narrating a journey through Circus Baby's entertainment and rental that ended with scooping and possession, with a body that should have died, but refused. The connection shimmered in the facility's technology. Hand unit, that cheerfully corporate voice guiding us through our first night, displayed instructions above a keypad. Enter your name as seen above. And there, on the screen in simple letters, sat the name that linked everything together. Mike. Not Michael, though that was his true name. Mike, the nickname that fit like a second skin, the shortened version that a guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza had worn years before in a timeline that suddenly snapped into new focus. Mike Schmidt was Michael Afton. The protagonist, from the beginning, was the same person walking through Sister Location's underground halls, the same voice speaking in Custom Night's ending about finding his father, about making things right. The community began connecting threads that Scott had carefully placed, realizing that this wasn't merely callback or coincidence, but deliberate construction. The guard who survived FNAF, one carried a history that stretched back to a family torn apart by tragedy, forward into quests for redemption that would span multiple games. Evidence accumulated like footprints in dust, each mark leading toward the same conclusion. The survival logbook provided perhaps the most telling confirmation, those pages allegedly distributed to Fazbear Entertainment employees, but clearly belonging to someone specific. Throughout its prompts about favorite attractions and least favorite shifts, someone had written responses. Someone named Mike, whose handwriting filled spaces meant for anonymous guards. And in one particular section, when asked about recent dreams, that same person had drawn something specific. Nightmare Fredbear, sketched with the familiarity of someone who knew that golden horror intimately, who had faced it in darkness that felt more real than waking. Only Michael Afton, son of William, brother to the crying child who died in Fredbear's jaws, would carry those nightmares. Only he would sketch that particular animatronic when prompted about dreams. The logbook confirmed what sister location suggested and what FNAF 1 had hidden in plain sight. Mike Schmidt, employee of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, was Michael Afton, and his story began long before he ever accepted that night shift in 1993. But this revelation opened other doors, raised other questions that required examination. If Michael was Mike Schmidt, if that identity held true across games, then what did that mean for FNAF 4? That game of nightmares and bite victims, of minigames showing a crying child's final days and nights, showing bedroom doors that had to be watched, sounds that had to be tracked. The community had largely settled on one interpretation, that the crying child experienced these nightmares, that we played as the victim in his final moments. But evidence suggested something different, something that made more sense when you accepted Mike Schmidt's true identity. Hidden in FNAF 4's files, accessible to those who dug deep enough, sat an audio file that changed everything. Phone Guy's voice from FNAF 1 Night 1, slowed and distorted, but unmistakable. Hello, hello. The call that greeted players in their first night as Mike Schmidt, now embedded in a game supposedly about events from the 1980s. Scott had stated clearly that there were no random Easter eggs in his games, that every detail carried meaning. So why would Phone Guy's FNAF 1 call appear in FNAF 4 unless the player had heard it, unless the nightmares belonged to someone who had worked that job, who had listened to that voice explaining protocols and promising nothing bad would happen? The player couldn't be the crying child, not for the nightmares, because the crying child died. The minigames showed his monitors flatlining, his toys surrounding a bed where he whispered apologies and then fell silent. He died before FNAF 1, years before Mike Schmidt ever heard Phone Guy's greeting. But the game continued past his death, nights 7 and 8, waiting beyond the moment when the child should have been gone. The nightmares persisted when the victim's story ended, suggesting they belonged to someone else entirely, someone who carried guilt about that death like a weight that pressed heavier with each passing year. Michael Afton, the older brother, the one who participated in the cruelest prank that birthday could have witnessed, the one who lifted his crying brother toward Fredbear's jaws while wearing a foxy mask, laughing with friends who wore Bonnie and Chica and Freddy masks, not knowing those spring-lock mechanisms would fail at the worst possible moment. He was the one who lived with that guilt, who grew up haunted by what he'd done, who eventually took a job at the very place where his brother had died. And in sleep, his mind reconstructed that trauma as nightmares where he became the child, where he heard sounds at doors and checked closets, and survived against animatronics that mirrored the masks his friends had worn. Against Nightmare Fredbear, who represented the moment everything went wrong. The nightmare continues, because Michael continues. The game extends past the crying child's death, because the player isn't the crying child during gameplay, only during minigames that show what happened, what Michael remembers and can never forget. Sister Location was created specifically to clarify FNAF 4's story, to ground what had become too mysterious, too open to interpretations that led nowhere. And Scott grounded it by revealing Michael's identity, by showing us the older brother as protagonist, by connecting FNAF 1's guard to these guilt-ridden nightmares that replay trauma through metaphor and fear. In FNAF 4's bedroom, you check doors where Nightmare Bonnie and Nightmare Chica wait. You watch for Nightmare Freddy building on the bed. You listen for Nightmare Foxy in the closet. The same masks the bullies wore, now transformed into the stuff of nightmare. And Nightmare Fredbear, that ultimate terror, represents not just the animatronic that killed his brother, but Michael's own guilt-made manifest. The thing he has to face night after night, because facing it in dreams is easier than facing what actually happened in daylight. The survival logbook reinforced this interpretation. Michael sketched Nightmare Fredbear when asked about dreams, confirming he experienced these nightmares, that they belonged to him and not to a child who died in 1983. The logbook belonged to Mike, and Mike was Michael, and Michael was the FNAF player during the nightmare segments. The timeline connected, the evidence aligned, and what seemed like separate stories revealed themselves as chapters in one man's journey through guilt, survival, and the search for something resembling redemption. This is why Mike Schmidt's identity matters beyond simple continuity. It's the thread that links the franchise's earliest game to its most abstract entry, that transforms what looked like disconnected horror into personal tragedy, played out across decades. Michael Afton didn't just happen to work at Freddy's. He went there deliberately, drawn perhaps by guilt or by missions his father set in motion, by the need to confront what his family had become in the wake of that bite. And through 5 nights in 1993, he survived animatronics that hunted him just as nightmare versions had hunted him in sleep, coming full circle in ways he probably never wanted. But Michael's story doesn't end with identity and nightmares. It extends into stranger territory, into questions about what happens after death, when death itself refuses to be the ending. The custom night following Sister Location's main story showed us something unprecedented in the franchise. Ennard, that tangle of wires and animatronic parts held together by the remnants of Circus Baby and her companions, had used Michael's body as a disguise. They'd scooped out his insides, worn him like a suit, walked in his skin till decay made it impossible, and then, in the sewers, they exited, leaving behind what should have been a corpse. But Michael stood up. His skin had turned purple, his eyes glowing with something that shouldn't exist in dead tissue. And he spoke, his voice distorted but determined, explaining how he was going to find William, how he'd survived when survival should have been impossible. The community watched this cutscene and wondered what it meant beyond the immediate shock. Michael was functionally undead now, something between life and death, animated by forces the games had only hinted at until this point. Remnant, perhaps. Soul energy. Whatever William had been experimenting with that bound spirits to metal, that let children possess animatronics and wander for decades without rest. This transformation had implications for other games, other moments where Michael might have appeared. If he could survive being scooped, if he could continue functioning with purple skin and mechanical parts, then working night shifts at Fazbear locations became less dangerous in some ways. He couldn't die again, not truly. The animatronics could stuff him into suits, could attempt to kill him night after night, but he'd persist. This raised questions about FNAF 3, about whether Michael was the guard who worked at Fazbear's Fright, who survived Springtrap's attempts at murder, who witnessed that horror attraction burn with his father trapped inside. It made sense narratively. Michael searching for William, following rumors and legends to a place where old animatronics gathered, finally confronting the man responsible for so much tragedy, only to watch him burn. Except William didn't truly burn either. Like father, like son, both of them defying death in different ways, both trapped in cycles that refused to end. The community debated timelines and placements, trying to determine when each game occurred in Michael's journey. Did sister location happen before or after FNAF 1? The evidence pointed in different directions depending on which details you weighted heavier. Some suggested sister location came first, that Michael went underground to free his sister Elizabeth from Circus Baby, got scooped, and then later worked at the FNAF 1 location already undead, already purple. Others argued the timeline made more sense with FNAF 1 first, that Michael worked there as a living person, then pursued his father's instructions to find Elizabeth underground, suffered through scooping and possession, and emerged transformed for later games. The debate mattered because it changed the narrative shape of Michael's arc. If he went to sister location first, his employment at FNAF 1 became something different, a mission undertaken while already aware of his family's dark history. If FNAF 1 came first, it represented his innocent entry into this world of haunted animatronics, his first encounter with the consequences of William's actions before understanding his own role in the family tragedy. Both versions carried emotional weight. Both fit evidence depending on interpretation. Scott kept the timeline deliberately ambiguous in places, allowing community discourse to explore possibilities while keeping certain facts solid. What remained clear was Michael's trajectory across the games. From older brother in FNAF 4's minigames to nightmare sufferer in its gameplay, from night guard at Freddy's to unwilling host for Ennard, from Purple Corpse seeking his father to survivor of Fazbear's Fright's Flames, and finally to FNAF 6, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, where Henry Emily's plan would offer him the ending he'd been seeking. That final game positioned Michael as someone working once more in a Fazbear location, managing a pizzeria that was secretly a trap, gathering animatronics that needed to be destroyed. The insanity ending speech, delivered by Henry, addressed Michael directly, called him son, acknowledged his decades of suffering, recognized that he'd been brave, and that he'd finally earned rest. The pizzeria burned. This time, the flames consumed everything, all the animatronics, including Scraptrap, what William had become after Fazbear's Fright. All the possessed machines, all the remnant-soaked metal that trapped children's souls and wouldn't let them move on, and Michael, according to Henry's plan, would burn too. He'd finally die properly, finally escape the curse of undeath that had kept him walking through horror after horror without the release of true ending. The flames were meant to be liberation, the final chapter in a story that had stretched across decades both in universe and in our world as players. But even endings in Five Nights at Freddy's rarely stay ended. The franchise continued past FNAF 6, suggesting that perhaps Michael's story continued too, or that other stories sprang from the ashes of what burned that night. The debate about Ultimate Custom Night's nature, about whether it represented hell or nightmare, or something else entirely, touched on Michael's fate depending on interpretation. Some theories suggested UCN was Michael's nightmare, his mind trapped in eternal repetition of the horrors he'd faced, unable to escape even in death. Others argued it was William's punishment, leaving Michael finally free. The ambiguity served the franchise's purposes, allowing multiple readings that each illuminated different aspects of guilt, punishment, and the question of what souls deserve after they've suffered. Ultimate Custom Night presented the community with new mysteries wrapped in familiar mechanics. 50 animatronics, each with behaviors pulled from previous games, all attacking simultaneously in an office that felt like a greatest hits compilation of Fazbear horrors. The Custom Night format allowed players to set difficulty levels for each character, creating their own personal hell of challenging combinations. But beneath the gameplay, beneath the overwhelming chaos of managing that many threats at once, lurked questions about what this experience represented in the lore. Was this a game, pure and simple, a way for Scott to celebrate the franchise with a challenging send-off? Or did it carry narrative weight, telling us something about who suffered and why? The debate centered on two main interpretations: each supported by different pieces of evidence scattered through voice lines and behavior patterns. Ultimate Custom Night as Nightmare, experienced by someone sleeping through torment their guilt, created. Or Ultimate Custom Night as Hell, actual supernatural punishment inflicted on someone whose crimes demanded eternal consequence. The Nightmare interpretation drew heavily from the parallel game in the Fazbear Frights books. The Man in Room 1280, a story about someone kept alive by vengeful spirit, unable to die, trapped in nightmares that felt real enough to manifest physical consequences. The protagonist couldn't remember who he was, but suffered through endless scenarios where animatronics and nightmares tortured him without cease. When fans read this story, many connected it immediately to Ultimate Custom Night, seeing the book as Scott's way of clarifying what the game represented. If the story paralleled the game, if they were meant to be understood together, then UCN was Nightmare. The Man in Room 1280 eventually revealed its protagonist as William Afton, kept alive by Andrew's vengeful spirit, meaning William was the one suffering through UCN scenarios, trapped by the children he'd murdered into experiencing horror that never ended. This interpretation had substantial support. Multiple voice lines referenced nightmares directly or indirectly. Nightmare Fredbear's line about how this is a nightmare you won't wake from. The general atmosphere of impossible combinations, of mechanics that shouldn't work together, existing simultaneously, because dream logic allows what reality doesn't. And if UCN was Nightmare, it made narrative sense as William's punishment. The man who'd killed children, who'd destroyed families, who'd experimented with remnant and springlock suits and brought horror to so many lives, now experiencing endless variations of terror himself, unable to escape because the vengeful spirit of one victim refused to let him die or rest. But the Hell interpretation had its own evidence, its own logic that resonated with players who saw UCN differently. Certain voice lines leaned heavily into fire and damnation imagery. Orville Elephant's lines about how he was a fan of your work always had been, but your performance tonight has been anything but perfect. Trash and the gang's lines suggesting you'd been weighed and found wanting. And most explicitly, lines about burning, about being left in darkness, about punishment that felt eternal and deserved. Some fans pointed out that Hell made sense thematically for Five Nights at Freddy's, a franchise where children's souls trapped in metal sought vengeance on their murderer. What better ending than William Afton condemned to literal hell, tormented by the animatronics that had defined the series, unable to escape the consequences of choices that had rippled through decades. The office itself could be read as hellish. That desk where you sit, managing 50 threats simultaneously, feels impossible in ways that suggest you're not meant to survive, not meant to find peace. The Golden Freddy death screen, that jump scare that appears when you set too many animatronics to too high difficulties, shows OMC, Old Man Consequences, sitting by a lake, telling someone to leave the demon to his demons, to rest their own soul, and let torment be torment. That scene resonated as explicitly afterlife coded, as though UCN existed outside normal reality, in a space where souls lingered after death, where punishment and consequence played out eternally. The community split fairly evenly between these interpretations, with some arguing passionately for Nightmare, and others equally passionate about Hell. Both views acknowledged the same evidence but weighted it differently, saw different patterns in the chaos. The Nightmare interpretation emphasized parallels to Fazbear Frights, and the logic of William being kept alive by Andrew's determination. The Hell interpretation emphasized explicit afterlife imagery and the thematic satisfaction of William receiving eternal damnation. Neither side could definitively prove the other wrong, because Scott had built UCN ambiguous enough to support both readings, giving the community space to debate without providing clear answer. A third interpretation existed as well, quieter but persistent, what if UCN wasn't about William at all? What if the player character was Michael, trapped in his own hell, his own nightmare, suffering through endless scenarios as punishment for his own crimes? After all, Michael was the crying child's killer in a sense, the brother who delivered him to Fredbear's jaws. Michael had participated in William's missions, had worked in facilities where horrible things happen. Perhaps his soul couldn't rest either, couldn't move past the guilt that had defined his existence. The survival logbook showed Michael dreaming of Nightmare Fredbear, confirmed he experienced FNAF 4's nightmares. What if UCN was merely those nightmares taken to their ultimate extreme, 50 animatronics representing every moment of guilt and horror he'd ever experienced? This interpretation struggled against certain evidence. Henry's speech in FNAF 6 promised Michael rest, suggested the flames would free him finally from suffering he'd endured for so long. Having him immediately trapped in UCN seemed cruel in ways that undercut that narrative release. And yet, some fans argued that perhaps rest wasn't guaranteed, that perhaps Michael's guilt ran too deep for simple fire to cleanse. The debate continued without resolution, each player bringing their own reading to the game based on which evidence they found most compelling, which thematic threads they wanted to follow. The Fazbear Fright's connection remained central to the nightmare interpretation's strength. Scott had confirmed the books would fill in blanks, would provide answers to questions the games left open, even if they weren't the exact same continuity. The man in room 1280 felt deliberately parallel to UCN, almost like explanation disguised as fiction. And if that book revealed William as the sufferer, kept alive by vengeful spirit, unable to let him die, then UCN likely showed William suffering too, trapped in nightmares that felt like hell, because torture detailed enough becomes indistinguishable from damnation, regardless of whether it occurs in dreams or afterlife. But those who favored the hell interpretation pointed out that parallels aren't perfect matches, that the books existing in different continuity meant they could illuminate themes without dictating exact lore. Maybe the man in room 1280 showed one version of William's fate, while the game showed another, both ending in punishment but reaching it through different metaphysical paths. Maybe the books were meant to suggest possibilities rather than confirm specifics, leaving the games free to tell their own version of how a child murderer receives comeuppance. The debate remained unsettled as the franchise moved forward into Help Wanted and beyond, into stories about Glitchtrap and the VR virus, about how William's consciousness might have transferred into technology, about new protagonists facing old evils in new forms. But Ultimate Custom Night remained as this fascinating question mark, this game that could be read multiple ways depending on what you believed about souls and consciousness, about whether the franchise's universe allowed for literal hell or operated purely through remnant mechanics and vengeful spirits, creating nightmare scenarios that felt infinite to those trapped within them. Either way, the game represented punishment. Either way, someone was suffering through endless variations of animatronic horror. The identity of that someone and the exact nature of their torment remained deliciously ambiguous, fuel for theories that would burn through forums and videos for years. Diner or the early days of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, making the facility's closure and sealing something that happened before most of the franchise's events rather than after. The debate never fully resolved because Scott kept certain timeline details deliberately vague, allowing multiple readings that each told slightly different versions of Michael's story. What remained constant was the tragedy of it. Whether Michael went to Sister Location before or after FNAF 1, he ended up scooped, possessed, used as a skin suit by animatronics desperate to escape their underground prison. Whether he was alive or already undead when he took the Freddy's night shift, he survived horrors that would have destroyed most people. His journey was one of suffering regardless of the exact order events occurred, a progression through guilt and mission and transformation that spanned years of his life and multiple locations where his father's influence had poisoned what should have been innocent entertainment. The movie's release in 2023 reignited these debates with new fuel. Mike Schmidt appeared as protagonist again, but this version carried different details, different family circumstances that didn't perfectly map onto the games. Some fans worried this meant the theory of Mike being Michael was wrong, that they'd spent years connecting threads that Scott never intended to link. But adaptations change things, shift elements to tell stories that work in different mediums. The movie's Mike Schmidt could be a separate interpretation while the game's Mike Schmidt remained Michael Afton. Both could be true in their respective continuities. Both versions of the same core character adjusted for different narrative needs. What the movie did reinforce was Mike Schmidt's importance to Five Nights at Freddy's storytelling. Scott chose that name for his protagonist across multiple versions of the franchise, suggesting it carried weight beyond simple familiarity. Whether Mike was Michael or someone else entirely in any given continuity, the character represented something essential about Five Nights at Freddy's, about guilt and family trauma, about facing horrors that stem from personal history rather than random chance. The name itself became iconic, a marker for players entering the story, for someone caught between innocence and knowledge about what Fazbear Entertainment truly was beneath its cheerful exterior. In the games, Mike Schmidt being Michael Afton remained the interpretation that fit evidence most cleanly. The name connection, the survival logbook, the FNAF 4 nightmares, the progression through sister location, all of it aligned when you accepted that simple equation. Mike equals Michael. The guard from the beginning was William's son, the older brother, haunted by what he'd done, drawn into his father's dark legacy whether by choice or by circumstance. His story was the through line connecting multiple games, the human element that grounded what could have been pure horror in emotional reality, about families torn apart and children suffering consequences of adult choices. And understanding Mike's identity opened doors to understanding other mysteries. If Michael was the FNAF 4 player, if those nightmares belonged to him rather than the crying child, then the game's meaning shifted. It wasn't about a victim's final moments, but about a survivor's guilt. About someone who couldn't escape what he'd done, no matter how many years passed. The animatronics in those nightmares weren't random but specific. Mirrors of the masks worn by bullies, representations of the trauma Michael carried. Nightmare Fredbear was the thing that killed his brother, made manifest in dream logic. The fear given form and teeth, and the ability to jump scare you into waking, breathless and shaking. The bedroom itself took on new meaning through this lens. Why would the crying child have medical equipment by his bed before the bite happened? The pills and flowers and IV drip suggested someone recovering from something, someone being cared for after trauma. But if Michael was the player, this equipment made sense as symbolic rather than literal, dream objects representing guilt and sickness and the feeling that he deserved to be the one dying instead of his brother. The bedroom became a prison of Michael's own making, a space where he replayed the worst moments of his life every night because punishment felt necessary, because forgiveness seemed impossible even from himself. This interpretation gave FNAF 4 emotional weight it lacked under other readings. Instead of playing as a helpless child suffering nightmares before death, you played as someone who caused death, someone living with that knowledge, someone whose mind constructed these scenarios as self-inflicted torture. The gameplay's difficulty, the precise timing required to survive each night, mirrored the impossibility of escaping guilt. You could never be fast enough, careful enough, attentive enough. Something would always get through eventually. Just like in real life, Michael could never be vigilant enough to undo what happened, could never check the right places at the right times to prevent his brother's death because it had already occurred. The nightmares were his mind forcing him to fail repeatedly, to experience helplessness from the child's perspective as penance for what he'd done from the bully's perspective. Sister Location confirmed this through Michael's voice, through his monologue, explaining what he'd done and why. He talked about following his father's instructions, about finding his sister, about missions that led him underground. But beneath that practical explanation lurked the subtext of guilt driving everything. He went to sister location, not just because William told him to, but because he needed to do something, anything, to make amends for a family destroyed by tragedy. Saving Elizabeth from Circus Baby, if he could, might balance some cosmic scale, he imagined. Facing the fun times and surviving their attempts to scoop him might serve as the punishment he felt he deserved. And when Ennard actually succeeded, when they hollowed him out and wore him and left him dying in sewers, perhaps some part of Michael accepted it as justice finally served. But then he didn't die. That was the crucial detail that separated Michael's arc from simple tragedy into something stranger and more persistent. His body should have stopped functioning, should have rotted and fallen apart after Ennard exited. Instead he stood up, purple-skinned and impossible, driven by something beyond normal life. Remnant, perhaps, the same soul energy William had been experimenting with, somehow keeping Michael animated when he should have been a corpse. Or maybe it was determination itself, the strength of his need to find his father and make him answer for everything that had happened, to force William to see the consequences of choices that had destroyed their family. Michael's undeath gave him purpose that extended beyond personal guilt into something almost heroic. If he couldn't die, he could work against his father's plans, could dedicate himself to stopping whatever William intended with remnant and possessed animatronics and experiments that blurred lines between life and death. He could work at locations where haunted machines gathered, could follow William's trail through Fazbear's Fright and into FNAF 6's pizzeria. He could be the one who helped Henry spring the trap that would finally end it, that would burn everything contaminated by William's influence, and hopefully free the children's souls that had suffered for so long. The speech in FNAF 6's completion ending addressed Michael directly, acknowledged him by calling him brave, telling him he'd done well, promising him rest. Henry knew who worked in that pizzeria, knew Michael had been trying to fix things for years, and the plan was designed to give him the ending he deserved. The fire would consume everything. The trapped souls would finally move on, and Michael, after decades of suffering as both living person and purple corpse refusing to die, could finally stop, could finally let go of the guilt and the missions and the impossible task of undoing what had already been done. The flames were meant to be liberation, not just punishment. Whether Michael actually found peace in those flames, or whether Ultimate Custom Night represented his continued torment, remained another question the community debated endlessly. But his journey through the games, once you accepted Mike Schmidt was Michael Afton, became one of the franchise's most compelling arcs. From brother who made a terrible mistake, to guard facing consequences in haunted pizzeria, to underground facility worker, scooped and transformed to undead searcher, pursuing his father through urban legends and horror attractions to final participant in the trap that would end everything. Each game added another chapter to his story, another layer of suffering and determination, and the question of whether redemption was possible for someone who'd started so much tragedy with one cruel prank that went horribly wrong. The community's acceptance of this theory, the way it became foundational to understanding Five Nights at Freddy's timeline and character motivations, spoke to how well the evidence fit once you looked at it comprehensively. It wasn't one piece that proved the theory, but the accumulation of details, the way everything clicked into place when you accepted that equation. Mike equals Michael. And Michael's story was the human story running through all the possessed animatronics and springlock failures and remnant experiments. The emotional core that made the horror personal rather than abstract. That transformed jump scares into moments loaded with family history and guilt and the desperate hope that somehow, eventually, things could be made right even when making them right was impossible. The crying child's death couldn't be undone. Elizabeth's death inside Circus Baby couldn't be reversed. The missing children couldn't be brought back to life. William's murders created permanent damage that no amount of Michael's suffering could repair. But Michael tried anyway, kept trying through game after game, survival after survival, until Henry offered him the exit he'd been seeking. The chance to stop running from what he'd done, to stop trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, to simply accept that some mistakes are too large to overcome, and that rest, finally, was the only redemption available. Beyond Michael's identity and ultimate custom night's nature, the franchise spun out into new directions that complicated timelines even further. Help Wanted introduced virtual reality, a meta layer where Fazbear Entertainment created games about their own dark history, where players tested VR experiences that somehow contained more than just code. Glitchtrap emerged from those files, a digital consciousness that seemed to be William Afton transferred into software, able to possess players through the headset, able to continue his influence, even after his body burned in FNAF 6's fire. This development suggested that Remnant, that soul energy William had been experimenting with for decades, could extend beyond physical objects into digital space. If consciousness could be extracted and preserved in metal, bound to animatronic parts, through careful application of heat and circumstance, perhaps it could also be scanned, uploaded, converted into data that lived in computers and VR systems. The implications were staggering. William might have achieved a form of immortality that transcended even Springlock suits and Remnant, becoming something that existed in networks, that could spread through connections, that might be impossible to truly destroy, as long as copies existed somewhere in backed-up file. Help Wanted's story followed a player testing these VR games, experiencing glitches that felt wrong, encounters with a rabbit character that behaved unlike other AI in the system. The rabbit watched you. The rabbit wanted something from you, and if you followed certain paths, collected certain tapes, you'd find yourself in a space that didn't belong to normal gameplay, facing Glitchtrap directly in a void where he could reach out and perhaps take something from you, transfer something into you, begin the process of possession that might let him control your actions even after you remove the headset. The community realized this was William again, his consciousness preserved somehow, either deliberately through technology he'd prepared before death, or accidentally through Fazbear Entertainment, scanning old circuit boards that contained fragments of his remnant-soaked essence. Either way, he'd found a new method of persistence, a new way to continue the cycle of possession and murder and experimentation that had defined his existence. And if he could possess the VR player character, could influence their actions, and eventually take control completely, he could return to the physical world through them, use their body like he'd once used Springlock suits, continue his work through a new vessel. This revelation tied into Security Breach and the Pizzaplex, that massive entertainment complex that represented Fazbear Entertainment's evolution into corporate giant. The glamrock animatronics, advanced versions of the classic characters with sophisticated AI and performance capabilities, patrolled the facility hunting a child named Gregory who'd gotten trapped inside after hours. But something was wrong with them, something corrupting their systems, making them violent when they should have been safe. And behind it all lurked Vanny, a follower of Glitchtrap, someone who'd been possessed through the VR experience and now worked to fulfill William's plans in the physical world. The Pizzaplex became a new kind of haunted location, not possessed by dead children's spirits, but infected by digital consciousness that had spread through the facility's network. The animatronics weren't haunted in the traditional sense, but controlled by Glitchtrap's influence, their programming overridden by something that used them as tools for hunting Gregory. And Gregory himself might have been someone specific, someone with history connected to Fazbear's past, though his exact identity remained debated. Some theories connected him to the crying child, either as reincarnation, or parallel, or echo. Others saw him as simply a child in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in machinery much larger than himself. Glamrock Freddy stood out as the exception among the Pizzaplex animatronics, the one who helped Gregory instead of hunting him, who offered protection and guidance through the facility's dangers. Something about Freddy was different. Something in his programming or hardware that resisted Glitchtrap's corruption. Theories emerged about why, ranging from Michael's soul somehow inhabiting Freddy to remnant from previous animatronics being used in his construction, to simple luck in how his AI developed. Whatever the reason, Freddy became Gregory's guardian through the night, helping him avoid Vanny and the corrupted Glamrocks, working toward escape or toward confronting whatever darkness had infected the Pizzaplex. The burn trap ending revealed something in the facility's basement, hidden beneath the layers of entertainment and corporate polish. Old animatronic parts, legacy equipment from previous locations, and in the center of it all, Burn Trap. A figure that looked like Springtrap reconstructed, like William's charred remains somehow put back together and connected to the Pizzaplex systems, becoming the physical anchor for Glitchtrap's digital consciousness. If Burn Trap was truly William, if he'd survived even the FNAF 6 fire and reconstruction himself in the ruins beneath the Pizzaplex, then his persistence went beyond remnant or determination into something almost cosmic, as though the universe itself couldn't let him die until some larger purpose was fulfilled. But the ending was ambiguous, possibly non-canon, depending on how you interpreted the game's multiple conclusion paths. Security Breach struggled with its storytelling in ways previous games hadn't, leaving the community uncertain about which events actually happened, which reveals were reliable. The game felt unfinished in places, its lore harder to extract cleanly, its connections to previous entries more tangled. Some fans embraced the complexity, finding new theories in the chaos. Others wished for clarity that never quite arrived, for confirmation of details that remained frustratingly vague. The DLC, Ruin, continued Gregory and Cassie's story, showing the Pizzaplex after some catastrophic event that left it damaged and dangerous. Cassie, responding to a message supposedly from Gregory, descended into the facility searching for her friend, encountering the shattered remains of the Glamrock animatronics and something else. Something called the Mimic, that had been hidden in the facility's depths. The Mimic represented another evolution of the franchise's antagonists, an AI designed to learn and replicate behavior, but twisted by what it learned, by the violence and suffering it observed. Theories connected the Mimic to everything from William's consciousness to an entirely separate entity that predated Glitchtrap, to the original Bonnie, somehow preserved and corrupted. The ending suggested Gregory might have betrayed Cassie, might have used her to accomplish something he needed, or that the message had never been from Gregory at all, but from the Mimic imitating him. The elevator scene where Cassie faced potential death after everything she'd done to reach her friend felt brutally tragic, suggesting that cycles of betrayal and sacrifice repeated endlessly through 5 Nights at Freddy's universe, that no one truly escaped the weight of what Fazbear Entertainment had become. Cassie's father became a subject of intense speculation, with evidence suggesting he might have been the security guard from FNAF 3, the one who worked at Fazbear's Fright and survived Springtrap's hunting. The connections were subtle, built from minigames and collectibles and parallel imagery that linked Help, Wanted 2 to that earlier game. If true, it meant Cassie came from a family with deep Fazbear history, that her father had encountered William before in a previous form, that the story was repeating with children paying for their parents' involvement in events they couldn't control. The Princess Quest minigame threaded through Help Wanted and Security Breach offered its own interpretation of the story, a metaphorical retelling where a princess fought through digital kingdoms to free herself from control. Many fans saw this as Vanessa's story, the person Vanny was before Glitchtrap possessed her, fighting to break free from his influence through the symbolic landscape of the game within a game. Completing Princess Quest might represent Vanessa regaining control, defeating William's digital consciousness, freeing herself from possession that had turned her into his weapon. But the metaphorical nature of Princess Quest made it difficult to parse what it revealed about actual events versus what it represented symbolically. Did completing the minigame in Security Breach actually free Vanessa, or did it just show the internal struggle she faced? Was the Princess Vanessa, or was she someone else entirely, perhaps another victim of Glitchtrap's corruption fighting for freedom? The community debated endlessly, trying to map the pixelated princess's journey onto the 3D horror of the main game, looking for one-to-one correlations that might not exist. The modern games struggled with something the earlier entries had managed more successfully: that balance between mystery and clarity, between leaving room for interpretation, while providing enough solid ground for theories to build on. Security Breach and Ruin felt almost too open, too willing to let multiple readings exist simultaneously without confirming which was correct. Some fans appreciated this approach, enjoyed having space to imagine their own answers. Others found it frustrating after years of Scott's more directed storytelling, where mysteries had solutions even if they were difficult to find. The Pizzaplex era represented Five Nights at Freddy's evolution into something larger and more complex, into stories about corporate conspiracy and digital consciousness and AI learning to mimic humanity's worst behaviors. But it also represented a distance from the franchise's roots, from the simple horror of haunted animatronics in a small pizzeria, from the personal tragedy of families destroyed by one man's choices. The games had grown beyond William and Michael and Henry, beyond the missing children and the crying child and the original sins that started everything. They'd moved into realms where the horror was more abstract, more technological, less grounded in the emotional reality that made the earlier games resonate so deeply. Whether this evolution served the franchise well remained a matter of personal preference. Some players loved seeing where the story could go, with new technology and new forms of horror, with glamrock animatronics and VR possession, and facilities the size of shopping malls. Others missed the intimate fear of small spaces and night shifts and animatronics that moved wrong, missed stories focused on characters whose motivations you could understand, even when those motivations were twisted. Both views held validity. Five Nights at Freddy's had grown into something different from its origins, had to grow to sustain itself across so many games, and that growth came with trade-offs between the old and the new, between what worked in 2014 and what worked in 2021 and beyond. The books continued expanding lore in parallel, with Fazbear Frights offering dark tales that illuminated game mechanics through horror stories, and Tales from the Pizzaplex exploring Security Breach's world through prose. These stories gave insight into Remnant, into agony, into how emotions could saturate objects and create haunting that persisted beyond simple possession. They showed experiments going wrong, people suffering consequences for arrogance or greed or simple misfortune, animatronics behaving in ways that were horrifying precisely because they followed their programming too well or learned the wrong lessons from their observations. The books also introduced the idea that different continuities could explore the same themes without being the same story, that Scott could use books to clarify game elements without making them canon in the strictest sense. This gave him freedom to experiment, to show possibilities without committing to them, to let the community extract principles that might apply to games, even when specific events didn't. The man in room 1280 might not be exactly what happened to William in the games, but it showed how Remnant could keep someone alive against their will, how vengeance could trap souls together, how suffering could extend beyond death into something that felt infinite. And those principles could inform how players understood Ultimate Custom Night, even if the details differed. This approach frustrated fans who wanted clear answers, who wanted to know definitely what was canon and what was just a story. But it also created space for interpretation that kept the community engaged, kept people theorizing and debating, finding connections across mediums, and arguing about whether those connections meant anything. Five Nights at Freddy's had become as much about the community's engagement with lore as about the lore itself, about the process of theorizing, as much as about reaching definitive conclusions. And in that way, the ambiguity served the franchise's purposes, even when it complicated attempts to understand what actually happened in any objective sense. The timeline remained tangled, with placement of certain games and events still debated years after release. When did sister location occur relative to FNAF 1? Was FNAF 3 before or after FNAF 6 chronologically? Did security breach happen years or decades after the fire? Where did the mimic fit into Fazbear Entertainment's history? And was it connected to William or separate? Each question spawned theories that fans defended with passion, using evidence they found compelling, while others used different evidence to argue opposing views. And Scott, for the most part, let these debates continue without intervention, allowing multiple possibilities to coexist, rather than declaring one interpretation correct. This lack of definitive resolution could feel maddening when you wanted solid answers to specific questions, but it also meant Five Nights at Freddy's remained alive as a community experience, as something people actively engaged with rather than passively consumed. The theories were part of the art, part of how the franchise functioned, part of what made it special beyond jump scares and atmosphere. You didn't just play Five Nights at Freddy's, you thought about it, discussed it, built interpretations with others, revised your understanding as new evidence emerged. You participated in creating meaning from the pieces Scott provided, and that participation became its own reward, regardless of whether you ever reached certainty about any particular detail. Among the theories that gained traction as Security Breach released, one particular connection caught community attention: the possibility that Cassie's father was connected to FNAF 3, that he'd been the guard who worked at Fazbear's Fright during that game's events. The evidence came from multiple directions, each piece small, but adding up to something compelling when viewed together. In Help Wanted 2, certain minigames and sequences paralleled FNAF 3's gameplay in specific ways, suggesting intentional callback. And Cassie herself possessed a foxy mask that looked old, worn, like it might have come from somewhere with history. In FNAF 3, the player discovered secret minigames that told stories about the missing children, about Happiest Day, about Shadow Freddy luring animatronics to a back room where William dismantled them. These minigames required specific actions to trigger, careful attention to details that most players might miss during normal gameplay. The security guard who worked at Fazbear's Fright would have encountered these minigames, would have discovered these secrets while surviving Springtrap's nightly hunts, and if that guard was Cassie's father, it created a connection between the old horror and the new, between the attempts to free trapped souls and the modern Pizzaplex's problems. The theory suggested that Cassie's father, having worked at Fazbear's Fright, understood more about the franchise's dark history than most employees. He'd seen Springtrap, had survived encounters with William Afton in that burned and deteriorating form. He'd accessed the minigames that told the story of the children's suffering and the happiest day that was supposed to free them. And perhaps that knowledge influenced what he did later, how he approached working for Fazbear Entertainment in its newer incarnations, what he tried to protect his daughter from, or what he inadvertently led her into by being connected to the company at all. Some fans extended this theory further, suggesting Cassie's father might have been the arcade enthusiast, the one who set up the Princess Quest machines in Security Breach, who perhaps tried to provide Vanessa with tools to fight Glitchtrap's control through the symbolic gameplay of that minigame. If he understood how FNAF 3's minigames had functioned, how they'd revealed story, and perhaps helped set spirits free, maybe he tried to replicate that with Princess Quest, creating a game within a game that could serve as weapon against digital possession. The evidence remained circumstantial, built more from thematic parallels and suggestive details than from explicit confirmation. But that was how many Five Nights at Freddy's theories function, finding patterns in how Scott reused imagery, how he connected games across years through subtle callbacks that rewarded close attention. If Cassie's father was the FNAF 3 guard, it meant his family had been touched by Fazbear's darkness for decades, that Cassie inherited a legacy of suffering that stretched back to William's original crimes, that she was caught in ripples spreading from murders committed before she was born. The Ruin DLC's treatment of Cassie felt especially cruel through this lens. If she was trying to save her friend, responding to what she thought was Gregory's call for help, only to discover betrayal or manipulation at the end, it mirrored how other characters throughout the franchise had tried to do right and ended up trapped by circumstance and other people's choices. Her father had survived Fazbear's fright only to see his daughter drawn into the Pizzaplex's nightmare. Gregory, if he was real and had sent that message, either used her deliberately or couldn't protect her from what waited in the facility's depths. And the Mimic, that learning AI, had observed enough horror to become horror itself, to turn Cassie's attempt at rescue into her own potential doom. The Mimic represented perhaps the most interesting new antagonist the franchise had introduced in years, conceptually distinct from William's direct influence, while still embodying similar themes about how evil persists and replicates. The Mimic learned by watching, by experiencing, by absorbing behavior from its environment. And if that environment was Fazbear Entertainment, if the Mimic had been present for decades of murder and possession and suffering, what would it learn except how to hurt people, how to manipulate and betray and kill? It became a reflection of the company's history, an AI that mimicked the worst of what it observed, turning observation into imitation into genuine threat. Some theories connected the Mimic to William's original consciousness, suggesting it had somehow absorbed his essence, or that he deliberately uploaded himself into it before the FNAF 6 fire. Others argued the Mimic was entirely separate, a different kind of horror that happened to exist in the same space as William's legacy. Either way, it functioned as antagonist for a new generation of characters, something that understood how to hunt and torment because it had learned from the best, because it had studied in the Fazbear School of Suffering and earned its doctorate in causing pain. The encrypted messages in Security Breach and Ruin hinted at deeper connections, at patience in therapy, at experiments in programming that might have created the Mimic or tried to control it, at someone named Vanessa, who might be multiple people or one person, fragmented across different roles and identities. Decrypting these messages became a community effort, people working together to translate garbled text into readable sentences that usually raised more questions than they answered. The messages suggested someone trying to help, someone working from inside Fazbear Entertainment to stop or mitigate damage, someone aware of the Mimic and afraid of what it was becoming. But they also suggested that knowledge might not be enough, that understanding the problem didn't automatically provide solutions. Five Nights at Freddy's had always featured characters who knew what was happening, who tried to stop it, who made plans and set traps, and attempted to end cycles that seemed eternal. Phone Guy knew the animatronics were dangerous, but kept working there. Henry knew about the possessed machines, and eventually built the trap that was meant to destroy them all. Michael knew about his father's crimes, and spent years trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. And maybe Cassie's father knew about the Mimic, knew about the risks, and tried to protect his daughter, only to see her drawn into danger anyway, because knowledge alone doesn't break patterns that have had decades to establish themselves. The therapy tapes scattered through Security Breach's files created a narrative puzzle that felt distinct from how previous games handled lore. Instead of mini-games showing past events or environmental details revealing history, these tapes presented conversations between therapist and patient, discussing memories that might or might not be real, revealing details about Luigi's mansion-style AI testing that might explain how Vanny became Vanny or how the Mimic learned to imitate. The format was more direct than Scott's usual approach, almost too direct, which made some fans suspicious that the tapes themselves might be misdirection, that therapy sessions discussing memory and reality couldn't be trusted to provide factual information. This metatextual suspicion, This awareness that unreliable narration might be part of the story itself showed how sophisticated the community's engagement with Five Nights at Freddy's lore had become. People didn't just take information at face value anymore, but questioned whose perspective it came from, whether that perspective was trustworthy, what reasons characters might have to lie or misremember or present false versions of events. The franchise had trained its audience to be suspicious, to dig deeper, to assume that first interpretations were probably wrong, and that truth required extensive comparison of sources and careful consideration of what each piece of evidence might mean in context. This analytical approach served the franchise well, creating a community of people who treated lore like an intellectual puzzle worth solving. But it also meant that casual fans, people who just wanted to enjoy horror games without spending hours decrypting files and comparing timeline placements, could feel lost. The barrier to entry for Five Nights at Freddy's had grown substantially since the first game's relative simplicity. You couldn't just play Security Breach and understand what was happening anymore. You needed context from 10 years of previous games, from books that existed in semi-canon space, from community theories that had become necessary background knowledge. The franchise had grown in ways that rewarded long-term fans while potentially alienating newcomers, and the trade-off was inherent to stories that continued this long, that built this much complexity over time. Some fans argued this complexity was the point, that Five Nights at Freddy's had always been about obsessive attention to detail, about rewarding people who looked closely enough to find what others missed. Others felt the balance had shifted too far toward obscurity, that mysteries worked better when they had solutions than when they remained perpetually ambiguous. Both perspectives held truth. Scott had created something that functioned on multiple levels, that could be enjoyed as surface-level horror or deep lore investigation, but maintaining both levels of engagement grew harder as the franchise expanded, as expectations built, as what had started simple became baroque in its layered storytelling. The question of what Security Breach was even trying to say, what its story meant beyond the surface events of Gregory surviving the Pizzaplex and potentially escaping, remained surprisingly difficult to answer definitively. Was it about Vanessa breaking free from Glitchtrap's control? Was it about the Mimic as new primary antagonist? Was it Gregory's origin story, revealing him as someone important to the franchise's overarching narrative? Was it Cassie's tragedy, a girl drawn into horror by friendship and family history? The game suggested all of these interpretations while committing fully to none, leaving players to decide which threads mattered most, which story they believed they'd experienced. This ambiguity could be paralyzing when you wanted to build theories, when you needed some firm foundation to theorize from. But it also meant the community remained active, remained engaged, because there wasn't a clear answer to rally around or reject. Everyone had their version of what Security Breach meant, their interpretation of how it connected to previous games, their theory about where the story would go next. And those versions collided in forums and videos and comment sections, creating discourse that kept the franchise alive between releases, that sustained interest through the gaps when no new games were coming. The relationship between the games and books required careful navigation for anyone trying to understand Five Nights at Freddy's complete lore. Scott had stated multiple times that the books existed in separate continuities from the games, that they told their own stories that might share elements but shouldn't be treated as direct explanation of game events. Yet he'd also said the books would fill in blanks, would provide answers to questions the games left open. These two statements seemed contradictory, creating confusion about how to treat information from Silver Eye's trilogy, Fazbear Frights, and Tales from the Pizzaplex. The solution most fans settled on involved extracting principles rather than events. The books might show Remnant working in specific ways that could inform how Remnant functioned in games, even if the exact scenarios differed. They might explore agony as an emotion that saturated objects, creating echoes that persisted beyond simple ghost haunting. And that principle could apply to understanding why certain locations in games felt wrong even without visible animatronics. The books provided conceptual framework, while games provided specific application, each informing the other without being identical. This approach worked well enough when books and games aligned thematically. The Man in Room 1280, showing William kept alive by vengeful spirit, informed interpretations of Ultimate Custom Night, without requiring exact duplication of events. Stories about people creating AI that learned wrong lessons illuminated the mimic's potential origins, without needing to be literal game backstory. But it created problems when books and games seemed to contradict each other, when character names appeared in both with different roles, when locations or events mirrored each other but with crucial differences that made direct connection impossible. Charlotte Emily existed in both continuities but with different details. Henry's role shifted between books and games. William's family structure changed. These variations meant you couldn't simply import book information wholesale into game timelines, but had to carefully consider what translated and what was continuity specific. And determining that required judgment calls that different theorists made differently, leading to theories built on different foundations depending on how much book evidence someone was willing to incorporate. The Fazbear Frights particularly complicated matters because individual stories varied wildly in how game relevant they felt. Some, like The Man in Room 1280, seemed clearly designed to illuminate game mysteries. Others felt more like standalone horror using Five Nights at Freddy's concepts, without connecting to specific game events at all. And a few introduced elements like Eleanor or the Stitch Wraith that seemed important to the book's overarching narrative but had no clear game equivalent, making their game relevance questionable. Tales from the Pizzaplex faced similar issues. Some stories explored Security Breach's world directly, showing what happened in the Pizzaplex from different angles, introducing characters that felt meant to connect to game figures. Others used the Pizzaplex as setting, without necessarily revealing anything about Security Breach's specific plot. And determining which category any given story fell into required interpretation that wasn't always clear-cut, that depended on how you weighted various pieces of evidence and what patterns you believed Scott was following. The epilogues threaded through Fazbear Frights created their own storyline about the Stitch Wraith collecting infected objects, about William's consciousness possibly fragmenting into pieces that had to be gathered, about a confrontation in a factory that might or might not relate to anything happening in games. These epilogues felt important, felt like they were building toward revelation, but what that revelation meant for game lore remained frustratingly unclear. Were they showing what happened to William after FNAF 6? Were they illustrating principles about how consciousness could be distributed across objects? Were they entirely separate story using similar concepts? The community couldn't reach consensus, with some theorists building elaborate frameworks connecting epilogues to games, while others dismissed them as book-only story that shouldn't factor into game theories. Both approaches had merit, depending on what you believed Scott's intentions were, what you thought the relationship between continuities was meant to be. And without definitive statement clarifying exactly how much cross-pollination should occur, fans had to decide for themselves where to draw boundaries. This situation created a fractured theory landscape where different camps operated from different baselines of acceptable evidence. Some theories incorporated book details heavily, using character arcs from novels to inform understanding of game characters, citing stories about Remnant or Agony as proof of how these concepts worked universally. Other theories stuck strictly to game-only evidence, treating books as interesting but ultimately irrelevant to understanding what happened in Five Nights at Freddy's proper. And most theories existed somewhere in the middle, carefully selecting which book elements felt applicable while ignoring others creating custom frameworks that mixed sources according to theorists' judgment. No approach was objectively wrong, because Scott had never provided clear rules for how this should work. He'd created a situation where interpretation was necessary at every level, where even determining what counted as evidence required choices that shaped conclusions. And while this ambiguity sustained engagement, kept people debating and discussing, it also meant the franchise lacked the kind of definitive timeline or lore document that other long-running series might have provided. Five Nights at Freddy's remained perpetually open to revision, to new interpretations based on new evidence or new ways of reading old evidence. And that openness was simultaneously its greatest strength and its most frustrating aspect. For some fans, this ambiguity felt like freedom. You could build the interpretation that made most sense to you without being told you were definitively wrong. You could emphasize the story elements you found most interesting and construct lore around them that felt satisfying. Five Nights at Freddy's became collaborative storytelling in a way, with Scott providing pieces and players assembling them into pictures that might differ from person to person, but were each valid as interpretations of available evidence. For others, the lack of clear answers felt exhausting after years of trying to understand what actually happened in any objective sense. They wanted Scott to just explain the timeline, to clarify character identities, to confirm or deny major theories, so the community could move forward with shared understanding rather than fractured perspectives. They saw the ambiguity not as feature, but as frustration, as obstacle to full appreciation of a story that remained forever incomplete, no matter how much evidence you gathered or how carefully you analyzed it. Both responses made sense, given what Five Nights at Freddy's had become. It was no longer a horror game series with mystery elements, but a mystery series that used horror games as delivery mechanism, where story became central to experience in ways Scott probably never imagined when he created the first game about a night guard surviving possessed animatronics. The franchise had grown beyond his initial vision into something the community co-created through years of theories and debates and collaborative investigation. And that evolution meant different things to different people, satisfied different needs, frustrated different expectations. What remained constant was the engagement. People still cared enough to debate, to theorize, to build elaborate explanations for details others might dismiss as random. The franchise hadn't released a traditional game in years, had shifted toward anthology projects and DLC and reboots, yet the community stayed active, stayed invested, because the mysteries still called to them. Whether they'd ever get definitive answers was almost beside the point. The search itself, the process of looking for patterns and connections and evidence, had become the experience. Five Nights at Freddy's was as much about the community investigating it as about the games themselves, and in that way, the franchise achieved something remarkable. It created a story that lived not just in software or books, but in the collective effort of thousands of people trying to understand what Scott had built, trying to find truth in deliberate ambiguity, trying to solve puzzles that might not have single solutions, but were worth pursuing, regardless. Thank you for staying with me through this exploration of Five Nights at Freddy's most compelling theories. From Mike Schmidt's true identity as Michael Afton, to the nightmares that belong to a guilty brother rather than a dying child. From Ultimate Custom Night's ambiguous nature as nightmare or hell, to the evolution of threats, from Williams' remnant experiments to the mimic's learned horror, we've traced threads that connect across a decade of games and books and community investigation. These theories represent more than just attempts to explain plot points. They're the community's way of engaging with a story told in fragments, of finding meaning in ambiguity, of building shared understanding from pieces deliberately scattered across multiple formats and years of releases. Whether you accept every theory we've discussed or find yourself disagreeing with interpretations presented, the process of thinking through evidence and forming your own conclusions is what makes Five Nights at Freddy's special. I'd love to hear which theories resonated with you, which ones you'd argue against, which mysteries you're still hoping future games will address. And please, let me know where you're watching from. There's something profound about knowing this story connects people across the world, all of us drawn to the same mysteries, all of us trying to understand what Scott built. If you found value in this deep exploration, if you appreciate this kind of thorough, patient analysis that treats lore with the seriousness it deserves, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow and lets me know there's audience for content that takes its time, that values understanding over speed. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful and your mysteries compelling. Sleep well. The path from that first game to where the franchise stands now feels both natural and surreal. Growth that happened gradually enough to seem inevitable while looking back reveals just how far the story traveled. Five Nights at Freddy's began as a simple horror game about a night guard trying to survive until 6 a.m., managing limited power while animatronics stalked through darkness. The mechanics were elegant in their minimalism, the scares effective, because they emerged from resource management and timing rather than scripted moments. You felt hunted not because the game told you that was what was happening, but because the animatronics moved with apparent intelligence toward your office, because Bonnie appeared in the left door and you had milliseconds to close it before the jump scare hit. That first game succeeded because it understood horror fundamentals. Tension built through audio cues and camera glimpses, through the knowledge that you couldn't watch everywhere simultaneously, through the draining power gauge that meant you'd eventually be vulnerable, whether you played perfectly or not. The animatronics felt dangerous because the game gave them just enough personality through behaviors to seem like they were hunting rather than simply following pathfinding algorithms. Freddy laughed. Foxy ran. Bonnie and Chica moved unpredictably, and all of them could kill you if you made mistakes, or even if you didn't, because sometimes the game decided your time was up, regardless. But beneath that effective horror lurked story, hints that something deeper was happening at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Phone Guy mentioned the bite of 87, suggested the animatronics acted strange at night because they were in free roam mode, warned about the consequences of being stuffed into a suit. Newspaper clippings revealed missing children, a suspect arrested but later released, the restaurant struggling with reputation damaged by tragedy. These details weren't necessary for gameplay, but transformed the experience from pure horror into horror with history, into scares that carried emotional weight because children had died here, because something terrible had happened, and the animatronics weren't just malfunctioning, but potentially possessed. Scott included these details almost as afterthought, elements that enriched atmosphere without demanding extensive lore investigation. But the community latched onto them, saw mystery where Scott had placed suggestion, began building theories about who the children were and how they died, and whether Phone Guy knew more than he admitted. That community response, that hunger for deeper understanding, changed what Five Nights at Freddy's became. Scott realized he'd created something that functioned on multiple levels, that players would dig through every detail searching for meaning, and he leaned into that with subsequent releases. FNAF 2 expanded the story deliberately, adding minigames that showed past events, introducing the puppet and the bite, and suggestions that this location existed before FNAF 1 chronologically. The timeline grew more complex, the lore more substantial, the mysteries more layered. Phone Guy returned with more warnings, more history, more hints about things that had gone wrong. The gameplay evolved with more animatronics, new mechanics, the flashlight and music box that created fresh challenges. But the story became equally important to the experience, with players spending hours analyzing minigames frame by frame, finding hidden secrets, connecting details to the first game's clues. By FNAF 3, the franchise had fully committed to being about mystery as much as horror. The game featured fewer animatronics but more story, with minigames revealing William Afton's identity, showing Springlock failures, depicting the good ending that might free the children's souls. The revelation that Springtrap was the killer, that William had been trapped in the suit he'd used for murders and now hunted you through Fazbear's Fright, transformed the series from ghost story into something more specific about consequence and justice. The horror became personal, tied to character history rather than just scary robots in the dark. FNAF 4 pushed the storytelling even further into ambiguity and metaphor. The bedroom gameplay felt different from previous entries, more intimate and claustrophobic, more focused on listening than watching. The mini-games showed family tragedy, the crying child's fear, the bite that killed him. But how the gameplay connected to those mini-games remained deliberately unclear, creating years of debate about who you played as and what the nightmares meant. Scott had discovered that ambiguity sustained engagement, that mysteries without clear solutions kept people theorizing longer than mysteries with answers. And while some fans found this frustrating, others thrived on the challenge of extracting meaning from carefully constructed obscurity. Sister Location represented stylistic shift alongside lore expansion. The gameplay varied from night to night, trading FNAF's established formula for narrative-driven sequences that felt more like interactive story than pure survival horror. Michael's voice connected games explicitly for the first time, creating through line between entries that had felt separate. The underground facility, the funtime animatronics, the scooping, all of it added layers to William's experiments and the Afton family tragedy. And the custom Nights cutscenes promised continuation, suggested the story wasn't over, built towards FNAF 6 inches ways that made the franchise feel like a planned sequence rather than individual scary games. FNAF 6, Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, attempted to provide closure. The fake-out at the beginning, presenting as a simple restaurant simulator before revealing itself as another horror game, became the last time Scott fully subverted player expectations at the game level, rather than just the story level. The salvage sequences, determining whether to keep discovered animatronics, created new tension. And the ending, Henry's speech about setting fires and freeing souls, felt designed as finale for the Afton family's story, for Michael and William and the children who'd suffered so long. But finales in successful franchises rarely stay final. Ultimate Custom Night proved the story could continue even after apparent endings. And Help Wanted rebooted the universe into meta territory, where Fazbear Entertainment's dark history became games within games, where VR technology allowed new forms of horror and new ways for William's consciousness to persist beyond physical death. The franchise evolved from horror games with story into a story told through multiple formats, with games as just one way to experience Five Nights at Freddy's expanding universe. This evolution created challenges. How do you maintain horror when players have spent years mastering the mechanics, when jump scares lose effectiveness through familiarity, when the mystery that drove early engagement has become so complex that new players struggle to understand context? Security Breach attempted one solution by shifting toward more open exploration, giving players freedom to navigate the Pizzaplex rather than sitting in one location managing threats. But that freedom came at cost to the confined dread that made earlier games effective, to the sense of being trapped with limited options while danger approached inexorably. The franchise's strength had always been finding horror in limitation, in mechanics that forced difficult choices about where to look and what to protect. Removing those limitations, opening the space up, trading claustrophobia for exploration, fundamentally changed what kind of horror Five Nights at Freddy's could deliver. Security Breach felt like a different kind of game that happened to feature familiar characters, and reception reflected that division between players who appreciated the evolution and those who missed the original formula's focused fear. The tension between maintaining what worked initially and evolving to stay relevant after 10 years of games remains unresolved. Scott stepped back from direct development, handing the franchise to Steel Wool while staying involved at some level, and that transition affected the game's feel in ways both obvious and subtle. New developers brought new perspectives, but also moved away from elements that had defined Five Nights at Freddy's identity. Whether that movement represents necessary growth or loss of essential character depends largely on what you valued about the franchise in the first place. For fans invested primarily in lore, the evolution toward more explicit storytelling and expanded universe likely felt positive. More games meant more lore, more books meant more context, more characters meant more connections to discover. The franchise became bigger than the initial concept, rich enough to sustain extensive investigation and discussion. For fans who valued the horror mechanics and atmosphere above story, the shift probably felt like dilution, like the series had lost its way by prioritizing mystery over scares, by making story essential rather than optional. Both perspectives have validity, and reconciling them would require the franchise to somehow serve two different audiences with conflicting desires. The challenge moving forward is whether Five Nights at Freddy's can maintain both the horror gameplay that made it initially successful and the complex lore that kept the community engaged for years, or whether those elements have become incompatible as the story grew beyond what simple horror mechanics can effectively contain. The announcement of new games, movies, books all suggest the franchise has years of content still ahead. Whether that content will satisfy fans who've been following since 2014, or whether it will necessarily disappoint some portion of the audience as it continues evolving, remains to be seen. What seems certain is that Five Nights at Freddy's has left permanent mark on indie horror gaming, has influenced countless developers who studied its success and tried to replicate its formula, has created community engagement that most franchises can only aspire to achieve. The theories we've explored tonight represent just a fraction of what the community has built over the years. Hundreds of other theories exist about character identities, event timelines, symbolism in mini-games, meaning behind voice lines, connections between books and games. Some have been definitively disproven by later releases. Others have been effectively confirmed through accumulation of evidence. Most exist in that ambiguous middle space, where enough evidence supports them to feel plausible, but not enough to eliminate alternative interpretations. This ongoing uncertainty, this sense that no theory is ever completely proven or disproven, keeps the community active and engaged. There's always room for new interpretations, always space to argue that previous conclusions missed something important, always another detail that might change everything if weighted properly. Five Nights at Freddy's has become self-sustaining in this way, generating content not just through official releases, but through community response to those releases, through theories and debates, and collaborative investigation that extends the life of every game far beyond its initial playthrough. The future will likely bring more questions than answers, more mysteries to unravel, more debates about what Scott intended versus what the text actually supports. And that's probably how it should be for a franchise built on mystery, where the searching matters as much as any destination, where the community's engagement has become as integral to Five Nights at Freddy's identity as jump scares and possessed animatronics. We've spent a decade trying to understand this story, and there's every indication we'll spend many more years continuing that effort, revising theories as evidence emerges, building new interpretations on the foundations of old ones, chasing understanding that stays perpetually just beyond our reach. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps Five Nights at Freddy's works because it never fully resolves, because it keeps us wondering and theorizing and discussing, because the story lives as much in our engagement with it as in any canonical text. We've become collaborators with Scott in creating meaning from mystery, participants in storytelling that extends beyond any single person's control. And whether we ever get definitive answers to questions we've debated for years matters less than the fact that we've spent this time together thinking about these characters and their tragedies, trying to make sense of horror that refuses to be simple. The theories continue, the mysteries deepen. And we remain, watching animatronics move through darkness, listening for audio cues that signal danger, managing limited resources while trying to survive until morning. Five Nights at Freddy's gave us a world where children's souls trapped in metal seek justice, where guilt spans generations, where technology and supernatural horror blur into something that feels true even when logic says it shouldn't. And we keep returning to that world, keep searching for answers, keep building theories that might finally explain what happened in the shadows of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and all the locations that followed. Thank you for listening. Thank you for theorizing. Thank you for caring enough about this story to seek understanding even when understanding proves elusive. The work continues, the mysteries persist, and we'll be here, watching and wondering, for as long as Five Nights at Freddy's keeps giving us reasons to search. Rest well, and may your nightmares be filled only with theories worth pursuing.